Welcome to 40 Fit Radio, where we bring you science-based, common sense information regarding fitness, health, and lifestyle for the 40-plus community. I'm your host, Darren Deaton, doctor of physical therapy with 28 years clinical practice experience, starting strength coach, and certified CrossFit trainer. "40 Fit Radio, real people, real fitness, real health."
Hey, welcome back to 40 Fit Radio. This is your host, Trent, and my co-host,
Darren.
And we are talking about programming today. The episode is called Programming for Life. We're going to take kind of a 30,000-foot view of programming today because there are dozens of subtopics we can get into, lots of rabbit holes here, but we're going to keep it high level. And in the future, we're going to run podcasts on various programming topics. Yeah. So let's kick it off with what you want our listeners to get out of this episode.
Sure. So I think the first thing to understand is if you have not been in the fitness industry or you're not a trainer, and if you're the average listener and you've been just exercising, it's important to know, first of all, what is programming? And we as trainers or coaches, professionals within the health and fitness field, we think of programming as basically the series of different elements that we put together in a program or a plan that is outcome driven for our client base. As we talked about in earlier podcast, I think we've established that strength is going to be the foundation of every program that we put together, Trent. So, I mean, if we have a client that comes into our gym, that the foundation for them to start with is going to be strength out of the 10 general physical skills, because it impacts everything. So when we're putting this program together, there are many different outcomes that we can drive, many different physical changes that we can drive in our client, in the masters. And so the way that we write the program and what we have our trainees do is going to drive whatever skill we're trying to produce a physical change in, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, I think that's an important distinction. When we say programming in particular, we're talking about training to achieve a specific goal. And we've mentioned this a couple times before in the previous podcasts about the concepts of exercise versus training. And the reality is that 99% of people out there in gyms are exercising.
Sure.
What we mean by that is they're kind of doing random things without a very defined goal. I mean, they may generally think about, doing some strength type exercises. They may do some cardiovascular type exercises, but there's not a defined goal of what they're trying to achieve and then logical progressive steps to achieve that goal.
Sure. And I think how many times, I mean, this is the classic scenario. How many times have you walked into a rec center, a fitness facility, a Globo gym, whatever it is, even a private gym, and you see the same guy or the same lady doing the same exercises, which that's not the biggest challenge. The biggest problem is they did the same weight that they did 3 months ago. So there's no load progression. There's no set and reps progression. There's no the fact that they're doing the same exercise is not necessarily the problem. The fact that the load or that the stress is not increasing over time in a linear fashion, because that's the safest way for us to train too. We've already talked about that in the Barbell Strength podcast. Is the problem. So basically, they're getting hot, sweaty, and tired. And let's face it, individuals that are ranked novices that have never done a fitness program, or have done some fitness exercise, or they've done something in their, in the past, they're going to come in and they're going to see improvement and gains for quite a while, even if they're just exercising, right. Open quotation marks, close quotation, but it's not the same as training. And so I think that's the important thing. The real take home here is that most people don't have a program.
Right.
They really don't, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. They don't know when to do it. They don't know why they do it. They may have a why as to what they want, but they don't know how to achieve that. That's our job. And that's why we're here today, is to create a general infrastructure on the program model for the masters, the 40 plus individual, to say, this seems to work. Now, remember, this is somewhat generic though. So if I have an individual that's an Ironman athlete and they've already been training some and they have a fair strength base and a good aerobic base, cardiovascular endurance base, stamina base, then I'm going to treat that person a little differently than I would someone who comes in and they are not doing anything and they want general fitness. They're both going to get strength training, by the way, but once we get past some of those hurdles and some of that adaptive change over time, things are definitely going to change fairly significantly, because the outcome, the requirement for performance on one end is higher than it is on the other. So I think it's important for us to recognize that since most people don't have a program, our job is to bring them some information and help them to understand that if they're exercising, we want them to spend that time more wisely, because let's face it, time is of value, and why not use it in a valuable way? It's a resource that we have, and it's one of those resources that we don't have an infinite amount of, if that makes sense. So.
Right.
So one of the things that's important to recognize when you think about programming, and Trent and I have off radio, off mic conversations about this all the time, and it's that whole concept of the fact that a lot of people don't understand that what we're trying to do really here is drive a stress. We want to drive a stress so then their body can undergo stress, go through a recovery process, and then adapt to that stress. If we provide a stress, and let me give you an example of a stress. If we provide 3 sets of 5 squats, or wind sprints, maybe interval sprints on a rower, or sprints, running sprints, or some other exercise activity, and we provide the stress and they recover and there's been no adaptation, we haven't done our jobs. Because if whatever we've done, we haven't provided enough stress to cause enough disruption in the cellular homeostasis, which basically means we didn't mix things up enough. And I don't mean mix things up in regards to variance. I mean, we didn't provide enough hardness in the exercise. Hard is good. Yeah. Let's face it, hard is good. Hard is what drives change. And so we want to drive the hardship. We want to drive a stressor that's great enough. But we also want to be careful that we don't drive a stressor that's greater than we need.
Right.
Too.
This brings to mind when I was in college, I think the P90X program that's now famous was pretty new at the time. And somebody I knew had got the program and brought it over, like, oh, there's no way you can do this workout. Of course, I'm like,
trash you, man.
Of course, I'm like, whatever, I got this.
It's like me and my first CrossFit workout.
And yeah, P90X is what I remember of it, and it's been a long time. So I remember that particular workout was just, it was a bunch of circuits. I mean, like 20 circuits.
Yeah.
And it's push-ups, dumbbell push-ups with with one arm kind of pulls at
dumbbell
the end.
Rows or whatever.
Dumbbell rows. Air squats, are just on and on
burpees.
And none of those individual circuits was that hard.
Right.
But you add them all together, and the next day, I could not move my arms. I couldn't.
Tyrannosaurus Rex
walk.
arms.
Yeah, I had T-Rex arms. I had to, I couldn't turn. Great. I couldn't articulate my neck, so I had to turn my whole body to look at somebody.
Great. You had so much eccentric work in that workout. You're just so sore, DOMs, and just crazy sore.
And so I think that's something that I've learned from you about programming, is that we want to deliver stress, so our workouts have to be hard, but it's very tempting sometimes to think that more is better.
Sure.
And harder is better. And it's like, no. We actually want something that's just hard enough.
Well, and that was one of the challenges I had within my CrossFit gyms, and it was that once members in a gym get that adrenaline high from a workout, which feels unbelievable. It's terrible while you're doing it. Like one of my buddies Ryan Young says, he says, we used to do workouts together and we used to do runs together. We did a run up in the mountains one time. It was a 10K and I was sucking crazy wind, man. It was just horrendous pain. And he looked over at me and said, come on, keep going. He said, you hate me now, but you'll love me later. And it's definitely true. It's the way we feel sometimes when we train in that mode, that high intensity interval type training. But what it does to your endorphins and your sport hormones, your serotonin levels, it makes you feel invincible afterwards. The problem with that is when we train always at that level, we seek the next high. Yeah. And the next high needs to be higher at some point. And then we associate that level of soreness or that level of trashing yourself with improving our fitness level. And it may not. In fact, many times it doesn't. It leads to overtraining. And so I always kind of put it this way. We talk about that stress recovery adaptation model, and we're going to do a whole nother podcast on nothing but stress recovery adaptation and elucidating that concept and talking about it more. But I think about it this way. The adaptation that we're trying to drive in people, the change in people's bodies and clients, and is basically we want, there's many different adaptations, but it's changing the 10 general physical skills and their characteristics. And then we might want muscle mass gain. We might want strength gain. We might want body fat loss, improved aerobic endurance. We might want improved mobility, connective tissue and joint health. And really probably the most important for most of our listeners, we just have to throw it out there. Most people 40 plus, they're kind of in that time of their life. I'm talking for myself here because I'm the only guy in the room that's 40 plus. I'm 50 plus. And that is, we want to look good naked. I mean, we want to look at our bodies and say, you know what, I may be 50 plus years old, but I have a youthful looking body still. And so that's a little superficial, but I would venture to say out of the hundreds and thousands of people that I have trained in the last 30 years, I think the number one reason why most people train is vanity. They want to look good, Sure. And there's all these other, you and I have a deeper sense of what we want out of training because we've spent a lot of time in weight rooms and barbell gyms and wherever, CrossFit gyms or whatever. But that's, I think people say they want to be healthy, but if they were if their doctor said they did all their blood work and everything, and they said, you're the healthiest person I've ever examined and ever done blood work on, but they looked in the mirror and they looked unhealthy according to secular society, they would consider their program to have been a failure in some aspects. Well,
and to be honest with myself, I didn't gain a deeper appreciation for strength training and sort of the craft of barbells, if you will, until I had been training for a while.
Sure.
It didn't come from a place of, yes, I want to learn this deep craft of training and lifting barbells and getting strong and hanging around other strong people and kind of absorbing things from them. That came later.
Sure.
And that I've found to be something that is a deeper satisfaction that carries me through training over a longer period of time. But yeah, I mean, heck, I was motivated as much as anyone by wanting to look good.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's an okay goal. That's not a...
No, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
I think there's some value in every trainer and every coach understanding what does my client want and how am I going to design the program to help achieve that? Now, in that same vein, it's important for coaches and trainers to be honest with their clients and tell them not only help them achieve what the client wants, but be able to shape that expectation some too to make it realistic and goal-oriented and focus and action-oriented and not just pie in the sky or wishful thinking.
Yeah.
And to also make it effective and demonstrative and so that they can use that fitness. We touched on it a little bit, Trent, but in this concept of stress recovery and adaptation, we use an acronym, MED, which is minimum effective dosage. So as we're applying this stress to our client, as a master's is going under stress in their workout, the goal here is that we want the dosage of the exercise activity, whether it be barbell training, CrossFit, endurance training, even mobility work. If you were doing mobility work and you're way overstretching a joint or you're stretching too hard, then in all those areas, we want the dosage to be right for the desired outcome. Why would we overdose? I mean, think about it this way. I mean, Selye does a great job in Barbell Prescription of explaining this and detailing it out, but we would never prescribe a prescription dosage of medication for an infant that we would for an adult. Yeah. And we would never prescribe something at the highest level of dosage before we've tried a lower dosage that's been proven to be effective in that particular medical condition. So we start with a lower dosage and work our way up. It's the same thing with exercise. It's the same thing with training. We want enough stress to drive change. Yeah. If you're not seeing change in your program and you've hit a plateau, there's most likely not the appropriate stress, but there also might not be the appropriate recovery too.
Right.
You know, so there's that involved too. So Trent, when we talk about, putting that program together, when I have a new master's client walk in the door, the first thing we do is I'm going to assess that individual as to what their existing fitness level is. Now, when I'm talking about fitness level, I'm talking about a general overview of the 10 general physical skills. Where are they at? Where are they at in their strength, their endurance, their power, their stamina, their speed, agility? Some things are more important than others in that population, but the big three are probably going to be where are they at in their strength, endurance, and mobility, really, because we've got to have some level of flexibility for us to be able to do certain movements.
Right.
So I'm going to look at those three things in their program, but I've got to assess them first to develop a program, because I'm not going to put everybody in the same canned program, even though I'm going to put everyone, whether they're a novice, an intermediate, or an advanced fitness individual, I'm going to put everyone into a strength program, into a barbell strength program, most likely, or some level of scaling thereof. I might have to put them on the leg press before I can get them on a barbell squat.
Right.
Or I might have to modify something based on a health issue or something, but I'm going to put them in a strength program first.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that for people who are uncoached, even if they come in with a fairly high level of fitness relative to the general population, it makes sense to again apply the minimum effective dose concept to programming. Where if somebody comes in and they're actually pretty strong, dude, I still. If I've had no prior coaching experience with that trainee, I'm still going to put them on a novice linear progression.
Absolutely, yeah.
And to first of all, just to establish a baseline of because there's several things that are happening here. One, there may be form issues that we can clean up that would create some new runway to grow our strength gains, right? But even on the programming side, it gives us a baseline for some data, right? So now we can say, okay, you can do this much for a novice level of training. Now we can make small jumps and then incrementally move them into more of an intermediate program if that's what's appropriate for them. So yeah, the minimum effective dose is really a concept that comes from medicine, but applies to a lot of different things in the programming discussion. Yeah,
and it applies to all the 10 general physical skills. I mean, you wouldn't have a 80-year-old male who can't stand with, we have a thing in the physical therapy world called the Romberg stance. It's where your feet put right up against each other side by side and you stand, and we do several things in that position, but you wouldn't have an individual who can't balance like that do a single leg stance, like a stork stance, or a single leg eyes closed stance, because if they can't do the lower level of balancing, you're not going to make them do a higher level activity yet. We work down low and then we gradually increase over time progressively, or at least that's the way it's supposed to be done. Right. So yeah, I mean, the first goal is the assessment for the program, and then designing the program to drive the change in the physical skills that we want changed. The beauty about starting, and we harp on this, I know I'm harping on this, people hear me say strength training 1,000 times, is that the beauty about erring on the side of starting first with masters doing a strength program is that if we do a strength program with a master's individual, we're going to affect everything. Yeah. We're going to affect metabolic rate. We're going to affect lean mass. We're going to affect fat loss. We're going to affect the potential for endurance and stamina base. We're going to affect mobility. We're going to affect everything. So I can't say that about all the other forms of training.
Yeah.
Like you can go right now and there's a particular gym in town, in the small town that we're doing this podcast in tonight. And you can go down, there's a brand name gym down the street, and they have a particular training model. And that training model is mostly a bunch of body weight activities and a bunch of cardiovascular stuff. But they're not driving strength. They're not driving strength. They're not driving power. And at some point they're not driving endurance anymore or stamina anymore. And so, there are a lot of attributes. They're only driving a certain level of fat loss, because if they never significantly increase the lean mass size, then the metabolic rate stays at a lower state. And so they can't drive change like strength training can first. And with a master, since that declines the most rapidly, that's what we're going to focus on. And that influences how we program the program for masters. And so all of them start with a barbell training when they work with me at some level, and that's the primary focus, assuming that they can do all the movements through the coaching session, the startup session that we've talked about in the previous podcast, in the Barbell Strength Program podcast. And then we gradually are going to progressively increase that over time in a linear progression. And so knowing where the client is first, where the masters is first, is most important. It's imperative. And then we're going to build upon that from there in our program. But everything, even in a group semi-private training setting, each person is going to have their own program.
Yes. All programs are going to go from general to specific,
yes,
right? So
yes.
when you've got a room full of rank novices who don't have
inexperienced
any
individuals.
Inexperienced. And by the way, rank novice is not a pejorative term.
No.
We're just saying like you have not trained under a program like we're talking about now.
It's a beneficial state.
Yeah,
actually.
and actually, you want to be there, right? Because you've got the most to gain. But if we've got a room full of them, they're all going to do, like you said, a strength-based program to start with,
right?
And it's going to look the same.
Right.
They're all going to do 3 sets of 5 on squats for the most part, right? There may be a few outliers here or there.
Right.
And they're going to do that for a little while. But as they progress and as they move through different phases of their development, their programming is going to get gradually more specific to that individual, to their strengths and weaknesses, to their goals as their goals evolve. As they reach one goal and they set new goals, their program will evolve. So it's important to understand that your programming at first may seem very simple. You can even think of it as like a template when we think of the starting strength novice linear progression as a template.
And there's a lot of them out there, like 5-3-1.
5-3-1,
right, strong
lifts.
Right.
Exactly.
There's a lot of things out there.
And these are very useful tools for the novice, but as you progress and as you develop, you're going to need a more specific programming. And that's why we have this philosophy, is so we have a model for evaluating, okay, what are we doing now? What is our goal? Right. We've got a model now to think about, how do I go now from A to B? Or I've gone from A to B, now how do I go from B to C?
Yeah, and I think it's when you think about the progression from an inexperienced trainee to a intermediate, a novice to an intermediate to an advanced trainee in any of the 10 general physical skills, in any training of those traits, as we get closer to their maximum genetic potential, their maximum ability for that trait, whether it be strength or power or speed or whatever, accuracy, endurance, the stress has to be greater. The stress has to be greater. What we have found with masters, it's kind of interesting. After training hundreds of masters, and we have the benefit of having a group of coaches within the strength world, a lot of coaches that are now training thousands of masters, and we're all collecting data and sharing data, whether it be just anecdotally on social media or in like Slack, things like that, where we have coaching channels and stuff. What we're finding is that for the master's aged individual, when we start talking about the programming variables, they do look a little different than they do for the much younger client.
Right.
Especially when we're driving strength changes. And I would think that it's fairly similar also for, from my experience with endurance and power and some of the other things. But so when we think about programming variables, they're generally grouped as, there's really two big categories. One is intensity, and one is volume. And when we think about intensity, we have to kind of classify, well, what are we doing? If we're strength training, it's load. Generally speaking,
the weight
it's
on the
load.
bar.
Right, it's the weight on the bar. If it's high intensity interval training, it might be the quickness by which, the speed of the workout. The shorter the workout, like in the CrossFit world, in a WOD, the workout of the day, the shorter the workout, generally speaking, the harder you're going to go at it, because you have less time to get reps in, or less time to lift loads, or less time, to do rounds in, whatever your measurement is for that workout. And so that could be considered intensity too. And it also could be power, how forcefully and quickly do you have to move a load or move your body. And so intensity is going to be very important, but also volume. And we could also think of volume as frequency. Anything that affects volume would be the set and rep scheme. How many days a week are they training? Are they doing 2-a-days? How many times per day? What is what's the total tonnage for the week? Yeah. How much volume was done in the last 2 weeks? How much stress has accumulated over the last 3 weeks or month or 6 weeks? And so that changes from trainee to trainee based on their development. Here's what I found training masters. It appears that I can drive intensity for a long, long time. In other words, as long as I keep increasing the load, in strength training at least, increasing the load on an individual, and I try to keep my volume as high as I can without overtraining them or creating so much stress that they either overtrain or they get injured, or they're not adapting quick enough for the next bout, the next session of training. That what I've found is that the intensity will drive their growth better than stacking a bunch of volume on them. Volume's a killer for a master's athlete or a master's lifter, or any individual, because what happens is the connective tissue just screams at us, the joints hurt. It's just, I find that, like when I'm doing barbell training, by the end of the week, I do a heavy, light, medium program right now, my barbell training, and then I do a couple days, 2 or 3 days of conditioning and some other stuff. But I find by the end of the week that all that volume is stacking up. And then I know I'm going to have 2 days of rest on the average, because I take Saturday and Sunday off usually, or just do, house duties and other things,
Sure,
recreational type stuff. Like I went wake surfing this weekend.
Oh yeah. Nice.
And so, use that fitness for something, but it might be hiking or whatever else. But I find that volume is the key, can be the killer for masters. You have to have enough volume to drive change. But as long as I can keep driving load up in the workout for strength, I can generally keep getting that masters to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger.
Yeah, and again, this is another rabbit hole. We can talk lot about
it's
volume.
About 5 podcasts.
Yeah, it really. I mean, there's whole books that have been written about this. We've mentioned this starting strength, basic barbell training as the kind of one of the foundational texts.
Barbell
on barbell
prescription.
Lifting. There's a companion book, Practical Programming, that's all about this, right? How exactly do you manipulate these variables to get where you want to go? But I think we could say generally that. Just thinking about it logically, right? There is an upper limit on intensity. Right?
Sure.
You can. There is a theoretical weight that you can do one time, and you're completely spent.
Right.
You're 1 rep max, right?
Correct.
And that is largely a theoretical number, because unless we're actually peaking for like a powerlifting meet where you are aiming to do a 1 rep max, at in the 3 lifts, then it's kind of a theoretical number, because it's difficult to actually perform at that level of intensity, although we can get pretty close in our training generally.
Yeah, and it's a constant moving data
point. And it's constantly moving, right?
Point,
as we get stronger, workout to workout, that theoretical number gets higher and higher.
Sure.
Well, but there is a cap, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we can only drive intensity so high until we end up, if we were at the maximum intensity we could go, we go in the gym, we warm up, we do one squat at the heaviest weight possible, and then we're done squatting.
Right.
That would be the logical conclusion of driving intensity up. So at some point we have to cycle intensity and volume, right? So it's kind of it's an ebb and flow, right? We drive intensity first. At some point we can't drive it any further. So then we have to kind of back off the intensity and then add in some volume. And then again, the intensity climbs back up, the volume comes down, and then so on and so forth.
Well, what we had this conversation with a group of coaches not too long ago, and it was basically this. And one of them has a gym that does nothing but it was Selye. He has a gym that does nothing but specializes in really 40 plus individuals, but I'd say most of his trainees are over 50 and in there. We've got one in his 90s, I think.
Yeah.
Matt Reynolds talked about this too. What he's found is if you have a younger trainee do a lot of volume at a much lower percentage of their 1 rep max, or let's say their 3 rep max, or even their 5 rep max in strength training, they could potentially get stronger, and you could drive that upper level 1 rep, 3 rep, 5 rep max up some more. If you do that to a 75-year-old and you don't drive some intensity, especially if they're an experienced trainee,
right?
And you don't drive intensity on that individual at some level, they're not, you can't do those lower percentage loads and build ongoing strength and continue to drive that number up. We all know there's an upper limit. And for our population of masters too, there's a functional upper limit too. What's of need? What's of purpose? What's desired? For not all males want to squat 500. Not all males want to run a marathon, and not all females want to do an Ironman or whatever it is they're using their fitness for. But our goal as coaches, my goal as a master's coach, is to be able to drive a general fitness level that's functional. And I think that's a much higher strength-based level than we see in the average gym. And it's being driven in generalized exercise programs that really don't have an outcome or goals or a plan to get there. We will deal with this. We will table this subject of setting rep scheme, volume, changing things. I think a great resource in general for the barbell community, the lifting community, is to go to the Barbell Logic podcast right now. There's a whole series of podcasts on the differing levels of programs, the different types of programs for barbell training, the different levels of trainees, whether they be an intermediate trainee or an advanced or a novice trainee, and how to basically, like you said, ebb and flow these, titrate these variables to drive upper level strength. The other thing is to a lesser degree within programming variables besides intensity and volume, we could also talk about things like exercise selection or the mode of exercise, whether they be doing barbell training or they're doing rowing or they're doing endurance training or cycling or swimming. There's the mode, the type of exercise. And then there's also things that we can change for our master's program, like the session design, how we're going to design work-rest intervals. When it comes to even for strength training, that's important. They do 5 reps. How long do we have them rest? That's very, very important, especially as they get to those upper level loads and they start to get to loads where they're going to have some failure. They're not going to get reps. And so the work rest cycles are also very important. But I think if we take a broader look back on this, like we talked about we were going to do, let's think about the general fitness program design for 99.9% of the masters that are listening to our podcast today. Yep. And so my experience from training most of the masters population is that they respond very well to this type of program. And when they do this, they're like, my gosh, this is an amazing program. I've got several trainees right now. They're blown out of the water by how they're advancing in their strength and how it's helping their endurance and how their joint pain's gone and all the different. I mean, I had a master's online training today that posted on his Instagram and on his Facebook. And I think Starting Strength Online Coaching shared it on their Instagram.
Oh,
and,
I saw this.
Jack Hefner, you know,
Yeah.
Hey Jack, what's up, man? And so he's a military guy. Thanks for your service, bud. And I think he's about to actually retire. He's an amazing guy. But he, lifetime bench PR 250, you know, at I think he's almost 50. And
Damn.
he has no rotator cuff on one shoulder. He's got a partially torn rotator cuff on the other shoulder. And we've been able to jump his press up and get his bench up and make his shoulders much more functional. And he's using the program that we're going to talk about right now, or a slight variation of it. And so we can get some great gains with this. So in general, what I like to do with new trainees that are masters, they'll do on the average 2 to 3 days per week of barbell training until we've built a strength foundation. Then, when appropriate, we might add in 2 or more days of simple conditioning to promote more lean body mass, to get a calorie burn if we're looking for a calorie deficit and we're trying to burn calories to get fat loss, or to also drive a little bit more endurance and stamina, and specifically too, if we're working on a particular sport specific or recreation need that the client or trainee has mentioned to us while in the gym. And when we're doing their, guess what? Program design. So it's very important that everything that we do in general drives their goals. You know, that's the goal behind the fitness program. It's return on investment. Then eventually we get into higher level skills and we could do some more sport specific work. But until the foundation's built, sport specific type training is really, it's useless. It's useless. I am better off spending my time building the basic foundation of general physical skills. Then I could also add in, you know, they also might want to try new things like yoga, martial arts. They might want to do other, try another fitness endeavor or recreational endeavor. I went wake surfing the other day, you know, and I promise you, I had plenty of strength to get get up on a wakeboard and to wake surf. You know, my legs felt amazing. I felt great. And so the good thing about using this kind of program is that we can drive a lot of functional change. Talk about functional exercise.
Yeah.
You know, this is a really functional program. And so I also, on those days of conditioning, what conditioning could look like would be high intensity interval training, like we've talked about before in our endurance training podcast or conditioning podcast. It could also be just sled work. It could be monostructural work, like on a rower or on an assault bike or swimming. It could be swimming. It could be running. It could be sprint intervals. There's a lot of different things that we can throw in there. But I really do try to keep those conditioning workouts fairly simple, isolated to body weight or minimal loads. I don't put barbell lifts as much in conditioning workouts anymore. I used to do that when I was a CrossFit coach. I feel a little differently about the use of the barbell and what lifts should or should not be in conditioning workouts. And that's another podcast in and of itself. But our goal is that all of these things will drive the change that we want in the master's program. But to support all that, we've got to make sure that our trainees are getting adequate nutrition, that they're getting adequate sleep and rest, and that they're listening to their bodies and giving us feedback as to how they're doing with the program we've designed. That's key. So if we don't take time to measure and to assess how the program is advancing, and I ask my online trainees almost every single training session, you know, how's it going? What's going on? And they're also telling me by their comments and by watching their videos. And then for the in-person trainees that I have, the one-on-ones and the group classes, group barbell training, or other conditioning classes, then I'm getting specific feedback. How's your program progressing? You know, if your professional trainer, open quotation, close quotations, is not asking you, how are you doing with your training? How are you sleeping? How are you feeling? What's your sense of wellness? What's your sense of your training? Then go find a new trainer, man.
Yeah.
So
It's it's important to make sure that the recovery part of the equation makes sense. And I'd say with that, when we look at programming from the big view, from the 10,000, 30,000 feet, it's always a different number. Have you noticed that? Sometimes it's 10,000, 30,000, 100,000.
We're not pilots. If we were pilots, we'd probably say like 36,000 feet.
Yeah. From the lunar 13.6 million mile view of programming.
From the stratosphere. Ground control to Major Tom.
It's a great song.
It's a great song, man.
Rest in peace, David Bowie.
Yes.
It's important to when we talked about training being work towards a definable goal, a defined goal, pick one goal and go after it. And do the things necessary to achieve that goal, and then pick a new goal. And sometimes what we want, when we're talking about looking good naked, for instance, sometimes that's going to require multiple steps to get to where we ultimately want to be. We got to play the long game here. So if that, if we're starting off and we're weak, we have not done a strength program yet, let's go get strong.
Sure.
And while we're getting strong,
right,
let's do the things necessary to do that. So that means using the barbells, doing a linear progression, and then making sure the recovery is there, which means eating plenty of food, lots of protein, so we can grow. We can grow our muscles.
That's
and
right.
then, once we get strong, we can change our goal and say, okay, now I want to lean up a little bit. Okay, great. Now we've got something to do that with, and we're going to change our eating habits to make that happen. So I think keeping an eye on that goal, and then sometimes realizing that it may take multiple steps to get from where you are now to where you want to be is important.
Well, you mentioned it earlier. We're going to take our client and we're going to take the master's trainee from general to more specific. But we have to build a basic foundation first. And we don't have at the present time a totally look good naked exercise. One exercise that makes you look good naked. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. It's the journey that's the important part. We talked about this the other day. I mean, it's the journey that's the important part. Point A to point B. And we keep pushing that point B out farther and farther and farther. And what we end up doing along the way is driving a crazy fit body that's really strong, that's got good lean mass, that looks more youthful because that's what youth looks like.
Yeah.
Is a muscular, fit body, and that's what we're really trying to drive long term. And along the way, what we really drive that's behind the scenes are all the health markers, all the biophysical and biohealth markers, the blood work, the blood chemistry changes over time, the hypercholesterol comes down, the hypertension comes down, the hormone levels rise, the sense of wellness rises, the sense of purpose rises, the libido increases. Everything increases as we're changing this person's body over time, but it doesn't happen overnight. But we should be in a program that's constantly viewing it as a program and not just exercise for the sake of exercise.
Right.
So,
the famous Greek physician, was he a physician? Hippocrates. Said, let food be thy medicine and thy medicine be your food. Something to that extent.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm going to revise that and say, let squats be thy medicine.
Yeah.
And thy medicine be squats.
Yeah, basically the gist of that is the redneck version is if you want to avoid medicine, then have a program, have a fitness program that is outcome driven. And, it's the best thing that I've ever done to myself. It's, I think even as a physical therapist, in the therapy world, I consider the number one change that I can drive in my patient base in their bodies is to make them stronger.
Yeah.
I can help a lot of medical problems, a lot of physical problems with just making them reasonably stronger. And so I think it has a lot of value.
Absolutely. And, this is something that we as trainees take an active role in doing. When we go and we train and we commit to a goal and we chase that goal and we walk that path, that's something that we're doing for ourselves rather than just popping a pill.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's times when we need to pop that pill, I'm glad we have them. I'm glad we have everything that modern medicine has to give us. But
Sure.
one thing it can't do is it can't give us that empowerment that actively choosing to do this and going after it and then chasing down goals does for us.
Yeah, I told
It's a special thing.
I told a 48-year-old patient today who's had chronic low back pain for the last 2.5 years, and he came into the office and he said, I'm looking for that fix that the doctors can give me that can get me to the next level of improvement. I'm just looking for that fix. And he has idiopathic, nonspecific low back pain. He's got some basic wear and tear in his low back, and he's got some pain. And I told him, I said, I'm not going to be able to provide that fix to you, for you. You're going to do it yourself.
Yeah.
You're going to do it yourself. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to do an exam today. We're going to find out exactly where you're hurting and what's going on there. But then what we're going to do is we're going to drive you to make you stronger. And we're going to do it in a safe way in a clinical environment. But we've got to restore in your mind that your path to your own wellness is in your control. It's not in the control of the doctors. It's not in my control. I'm just merely going to provide you the tools so that you can do it yourself. And I think that's the key. So I think we need to wrap up this podcast on programming, and we're going to do a lot more specific discussions. We're going to have a lot more specific discussions on programming and all the individual elements of programming in the future, whether it be for endurance training or strength training, or it could be programming your nutrition. It could be something in that area. But let's talk about the 40 Fit Pearls. The number one thing is that fitness programs should be outcome driven and training versus just exercise.
Also, we've got to remember we have a model for driving adaptation for reaching our goals, and that is we provide a stress, we recover from that stress, and those two variables drive the adaptation that we're looking to achieve, whether that's strength, endurance, whatever.
And the third thing is that strength should be the foundation of any fitness program for masters.
Yep. Assess where you're at in your fitness level now. This is something a good coach will help you do. Whether you're a novice, you're an intermediate, or an advanced trainee, you got to know where you're starting at to know where your baseline is to progress from there.
Yeah. And there are two primary variables that need to be manipulated in most programs, and that would be intensity, which we talked about, could be load, the speed, the power within a workout or session, and volume. And volume really relates to the specific parameters of things like frequency, how often you train, how many days a week, how many days every 2 weeks, a month, and then also the set and rep scheme of the particular program. It could be interval sets, interval reps in endurance training too. So volume and intensity.
Yeah, and watch out for volume.
Yeah.
When in doubt, drive intensity first, volume second, because volume can be a killer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so our basic program that we would recommend for masters would have 2 to 3 days of barbell training, and then probably a couple days of conditioning. And strength should never be deteriorated below a basic strength foundation. In other words, if your program becomes too highly weighed towards the endurance sector, then there needs to be a specific need. Maybe you're doing an Ironman or something like that, but we want to keep strength as the primary focus.
Yep. If you have stalled out on your existing program, take a moment and reassess. And remember the minimum effective dose concept that we've talked about. Change one thing at a time and try to find just enough of that stress to continue driving progress in your program.
Yeah, and last but not least, support all your training with proper sleep, rest, nutrition, and active recovery.
Is that it? Is that all the pearls?
That's it.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. As always, follow us on the Instagrams at 40 Fit Radio. Follow us on Facebook and join in the conversation about all this stuff. You got some questions, you got some comments, hit us up on Instagram, hit us up on Facebook at 40 Fit Masters Community. And as always, go to 40fit.com to keep posted on new episodes and new content that we're putting out. We'll see you next week.
See you guys.